The morning mist clung to the shore like the breath of sleeping spirits, but something was wrong with the sea that day. Old Dakota had lived 73 seasons by this endless water, had read its moods like the lines carved deep into his weathered palms, and never once had he felt the ocean hold its secrets so tightly. The waves rolled in with their familiar rhythm, each one breaking against the dark stones with the same hiss and foam he had known since childhood. Yet beneath that surface pattern lay something that made his bones ache with unease. The very air tasted different this morning, carrying salt and kelp scents layered with something indefinable that made experienced nostrils flare with concern. Ready to witness the day that changed everything for a people who never imagined strangers could cross the endless water? Long before sunrise painted the eastern sky, Dakota had made his decision. The great journey to the northern fishing grounds, planned for 7 moons and eagerly awaited by 43 families, would not happen today. His weathered hands traced the edge of the massive dugout canoe that had taken 2 full seasons to hollow and shape from the trunk of an ancient cedar that had stood longer than the memories of even the oldest grandmothers. The vessel stretched longer than 8 grown men lying end to end, wide enough for 20 paddlers and their gear, carved with the protective symbols that his grandfather had taught him when the world was younger and the mysteries smaller. Whale flukes danced along the bow, salmon leaped eternally toward the stern, and the eyes of the sea-eagle watched from both sides, all carved so skillfully that they seemed ready to spring to life when touched by moonlight or storm spray. Now it would remain pulled high above the tide line, secured with thick ropes of twisted kelp and cedar bark, while the village wondered why their most trusted navigator had suddenly lost his nerve. The first questioning voices came before the mist had even begun to lift. Ayanna arrived carrying her infant daughter, her face tight with the worry that had kept her awake since word of his decision had spread through the sleeping village like smoke from a poorly banked fire. Behind her walked Matto, whose son had been chosen as one of the junior paddlers for what would have been his first great journey to the sacred fishing waters where their ancestors had sought the silver-sided salmon for countless generations. The boy had fasted for 3 days, painted his face with red ochre and charcoal in the traditional patterns, and braided eagle feathers into his hair with such ceremony that his grandmother had wept with pride. Now disappointment clouded his young features like storm shadows racing across summer water. "The tide runs right, old father," Ayanna said, using the respectful term reserved for their most honored navigator. "The wind holds steady from the south. My grandmother's bones tell her that clear weather approaches. The moon showed her silver face last night with no clouds to veil her brightness. Why do we wait when the spirits smile upon our journey?" Her words carried the weight of tradition, the accumulated wisdom of generations who had measured their lives by the rhythm of tide and season, storm and calm. The village's stores of dried fish and preserved clams would sustain them through any ordinary delay, but every day spent on shore meant missed opportunities in waters that gave up their bounty only during certain tides, certain weather, certain alignments of season and current that came perhaps twice in a year. Dakota's answer came slowly, drawn from depths he could not easily explain to those whose eyes had not seen what his had witnessed in 47 years of reading the sea's hidden language. The horizon breathes differently today. Watch the line where sky meets water. See how it wavers, not like heat shimmer in summer, but like something vast exhales just beyond our sight. The seabirds know it too. Count them. Watch their flight. They stay close to shore when their nature calls them outward to hunt in the deep channels where the great fish swim. He pointed toward the usual fishing spots where normally the pelicans would already be diving, the cormorants already threading between the swells in their endless pursuit of silver prey. As if summoned by his words, a formation of brown pelicans swept past, flying lower than their usual height, their great wings beating with urgent purpose toward the protected coves where they rarely sought shelter during calm weather. Their flight pattern spoke of unease, the way they kept glancing toward the open ocean even as they sought the safety of shallow waters. Behind them came the smaller terns, normally bold in their diving pursuit of surface fish, now hugging the coastline as though the open water held some threat their instincts could sense but not name. Even the gulls, those fearless scavengers who would follow fishing canoes into storms if the promise of scraps beckoned, remained clustered around the village refuse piles instead of ranging out to their usual hunting grounds. The village stirred to life as the sun climbed higher, painting the mist with shades of gold and rose that should have seemed beautiful but somehow carried an ominous quality, as though even the light itself had grown uncertain of its purpose. Cooking fires sent thin columns of smoke rising straight up in the still air, carrying the scents of roasted clams and seaweed cakes that would normally signal the start of a great departure. Instead, those preparations had been quietly set aside, replaced by the ordinary tasks of an ordinary day that felt anything but ordinary to those who knew how to listen to the subtle warnings the ocean offered to those with wisdom to hear. Maddo's son, Chaitan, arrived with the other young men chosen for the expedition, their faces showing the confusion and disappointment of souls who had dreamed of this moment through countless nights. They had prepared their bodies with fasting and purification, had gathered their personal gear with the meticulous care their elders demanded, had painted their faces with the protective symbols passed down through generations of successful fishermen. Bone hooks gleamed white against the dark wood of their tackle boxes. Fishing line made from twisted sinew lay coiled in perfect spirals, and carved charms meant to call the salmon hung from their belts like promises waiting to be fulfilled. Now they stood beside the great canoe, like warriors dressed for a battle that would not come, their preparation and anticipation transformed into bewilderment and growing resentment. "Perhaps the spirits test our patience," suggested young Ayana, though her voice carried more hope than conviction. "Perhaps they require another ceremony, another offering to the deep water guardians who control the salmon runs and guard the secret paths where the great fish travel." She gestured toward the collection of carved wooden figures, polished stones, and braided grass that lay ready for the traditional departure blessing. Cedar branches, cut at dawn, still dripped with dew. Their aromatic smoke meant to carry prayers upward to the sky spirits and outward to the horizon, where water met endless water. Dakota shook his head slowly, his gaze never leaving the mysterious horizon that continued to shimmer with that strange, breathing quality that had first alarmed him in the darkest hour before dawn. "This is not about ceremony or offerings. The sea itself counsels caution. When the grandfather of all waters whispers instead of speaking clearly, wise men listen to the whisper. When the deepest currents change their song, experienced ears hear the difference even when younger voices claim nothing has changed." His weathered finger traced patterns in the sand, ancient symbols that spoke of tides and currents, wind patterns and weather signs, the accumulated knowledge of generations who had read the ocean's moods and survived by understanding its warnings. Old Namid, the village's keeper of weather lore, approached through the gathering crowd, her ancient bones wrapped in sealskin against the morning chill that seemed sharper than usual despite the clear sky. Her clouded eyes might no longer distinguish between face and shadow, but her other senses had grown sharper with each passing season, attuned to vibrations and pressures that escaped younger awareness. She carried her collection of sensing objects, polished shells that sang different notes when the pressure changed, dried kelp that twisted and straightened with the humidity, small carved birds that balanced on thin sticks and pointed toward coming weather with uncanny accuracy. "The shells sing low today," she reported, her voice crackling like dried leaves in autumn wind. "Lower than yesterday, but not falling as they should before storm. They hold one note, steady and strange, as though the air itself waits for something that has not yet been decided." She placed her weathered palm against the smooth side of the great canoe, feeling for vibrations that others could not sense, reading messages in the wood's response to atmospheric changes that most people never noticed. Even the cedar wood hums differently today. It knows something approaches, but cannot tell whether that something brings fortune or sorrow. The tree spirits whisper of change, but their voices carry no clear warning, only the certainty that what comes will be unlike anything that has come before. As the sun reached its highest point, casting short shadows and warming the village enough that people shed their morning wraps, the debate over Tekoda's decision began to divide the community along lines that had never before appeared. The practical needs of survival warred with respect for traditional wisdom, creating tensions that threatened to split families and friendships. The younger adults, led by Chaitin and several others of his generation, argued for immediate departure, claiming that every day of delay meant fewer fish, shorter nets, and harder conditions when they finally did undertake the journey that would determine their winter survival. "The salmon run waits for no one," Chaitin declared, his young voice carrying the passion of someone who had never yet seen his careful plans destroyed by forces beyond his control. "Our nets hang ready, our canoe sits perfect and strong, the weather holds fair, the tide serves our purpose, the wind blows from the right quarter. What invisible danger can be so great that it outweighs the certain hunger our families will face if we miss the peak of the northern run?" His gesture encompassed not just their immediate group, but the entire village. The children who would grow thin if the fishing failed, the elders who deserved the security of full food stores for the winter months ahead. But Shenandoah, whose hair had long since turned the color of winter clouds, and whose scars told stories of storms survived and wisdom earned through hardship, remembered other times when Tekoda's mysterious knowledge had saved lives. 22 seasons past, he told us not to cross to the Rocky Islands when every sign pointed to clear weather. We listened, though young voices called him fearful and old voices called him foolish. And that day the wind came up from nowhere, waves tall as treetops, crushing strength that would have broken our canoe like an empty nutshell and fed our bodies to the crabs. The fish were good that year, but they would have meant nothing to dead men whose bones lay scattered on the sea bottom. The women gathered in their own council, sharing the fears and practical concerns that the men's proud words left unsaid. How much dried fish remained from last season's catch, carefully stored in baskets lined with seaweed and buried in the sand to preserve their contents through the warm months? Which families could afford to feed their children through a delayed departure and shortened fishing time? What if Tekoda's caution proved unnecessary, leaving them all to face the hungry time with inadequate supplies and the bitter knowledge that abundance had been within their reach? Ayana spoke for many when she said, "We trust our navigator's wisdom, gained through seasons of bringing every soul safely home through storm and calm alike. But we also trust our need to eat, our obligation to our children, our duty to the ancestors who taught us that the sea gives its gifts to those bold enough to claim them. If the spirits have warnings to give, let them speak more clearly. Our children grow thin, waiting for signs that only the old ones claim to see, messages written in languages the young can no longer read." Yet, as the debate continued, more subtle confirmations of Tekoda's unease began to appear throughout the village and along the shoreline. The tide pools, usually alive with scurrying crabs and darting fish going about their eternal business of survival, lay strangely quiet, their normal residents hidden deep in crevices and under rocks as though some predator circled beyond detection. The hermit crabs, normally bold in their endless search for better shells, remained sealed within their borrowed homes. The anemones kept their tentacles withdrawn, despite the rich feeding opportunities that calm water usually provided. The sea itself, while maintaining its peaceful appearance, produced an odd sound when waves broke against the shore, a slightly higher pitch, a faint metallic ring that older ears noticed even when younger ones heard only familiar ocean music. It was as if the water carried different minerals than usual, or moved over sand that had subtly changed its composition, or responded to a weight in the air felt by older bones and careful ears beyond what ordinary senses notice. The afternoon brought a shift in the wind that seemed to validate every instinct that had troubled Tekoda since his pre-dawn vigil. The steady south wind that had promised easy paddling began to gust and change direction, never quite settling into the expected pattern for this season and time of day. More telling still, the color of the western sky began to take on a peculiar quality, not quite the clear blue of normal weather nor the honest gray of approaching storms, but something in between that made experienced watchers frown and check their signs repeatedly. The clouds that appeared seemed wrong somehow, their edges too sharp, their movement too purposeful, their shadows falling in patterns that didn't match their apparent size or position. They came from directions where no weather should originate, moved at speeds that defied the wind patterns visible at ground level, and cast cooling shadows that felt different against the skin, carrying hints of distant places and unfamiliar seasons. Nimid's shells began to sing in different keys, their notes rising and falling in patterns she had never heard in 7 decades of listening to their weather songs. The sound carried an urgency that made her old heart flutter with unease, harmonics that spoke of pressure changes unlike anything in her accumulated experience. Her kelp strips twisted themselves into spirals, then straightened, then twisted again, as though the very air could not decide what it wanted to become. Most disturbing of all, the small carved birds that had pointed steadily southwest all morning began to waver, swinging back and forth like confused animals trying to sense danger they could neither see nor understand. "Something vast approaches," the old weatherkeeper announced to the gathering crowd, her voice carrying the certainty that comes only from a lifetime of reading nature's subtlest signals. Not storm, not calm, but change itself, the kind of change that shifts the balance of things, that makes the familiar become strange and the reliable become uncertain. I have felt this only once before, in the year of the great shaking when the earth itself moved and the mountains sang new songs. Dakota nodded grimly, finding confirmation in her words for the unnamed dread that had grown stronger with each passing hour. The horizon still shimmered with that breathing quality, but now the effect seemed more pronounced, as though whatever lay beyond their sight had moved closer while remaining invisible. The seabirds continued their unusual behavior, clustering in tight formations over the protected waters near shore instead of spreading out to hunt in their normal patterns across the vast fishing grounds where abundance usually called them to range far from land. Young Chaitin, his earlier confidence shaken by the accumulating signs, finally approached Dakota with the direct question that others had only whispered among themselves. "What exactly do you see out there, old father? What danger threatens us from empty water and clear sky? Give us something we can understand, something we can fight or flee from or prepare against. This uncertainty gnaws at our souls worse than any visible storm." The navigator's answer came slowly, heavy with the weight of knowledge he wished he did not possess. "I see nothing, young salmon, and that seeing nothing troubles me more than seeing storm clouds would. The sea speaks in 1,000 voices, wave sound and wind song, bird cry and fish splash, the whisper of current against current, the deep pulse that rises from the bottom waters where the great creatures move in patterns older than our people's memory. Today, one voice is missing from that eternal conversation, and its absence leaves a silence shaped like approaching change." As the long day moved toward sunset, the village held an unprecedented evening council where every adult voice could be heard and every concern given proper weight. Never before had a single navigator's decision affected so many lives in such immediate and practical ways, and never before had the reasons for that decision been so difficult to explain or understand. The great fire at the center of the gathering place cast flickering light on faces marked by worry, frustration, hope, and fear, as speaker after speaker rose to offer wisdom, ask questions, or simply voice the concerns that weighed on every heart. The flames danced higher as driftwood seasoned by salt spray sent sparks spiraling into the darkening sky, each ember carrying prayers and hopes upward toward whatever powers governed the fate of fishing expeditions and the wisdom of difficult decisions. The smoke carried the scents of cedar and seaweed, charred shellfish and burning kelp, the familiar perfume of countless evening councils that had guided the village through generations of challenges both seen and unforeseen. Mato spoke for the practical-minded when he said, "Respect and trust flow both ways like the tide. We respect Takota's knowledge, gained through seasons of successful guidance that have brought prosperity to our families and safety to our young men. But he must trust our need for clear understanding. Give us signs we can all see, reasons we can all grasp, and we will follow his counsel to the bottom of the sea if necessary. But ask us to risk our children's hunger on invisible warnings, and even the greatest respect has limits." Shenandoah countered with the voice of hard-earned experience. Clear understanding comes only after events prove themselves. When the great wave came that destroyed the settlement to our south, did anyone understand its approach? The day dawned calm. The sea lay flat as a grinding stone. No wind stirred the smallest leaf. Yet before the sun reached its height, water taller than the tallest trees swept away everything they had built. When the year of no salmon emptied our nets despite perfect conditions, did wisdom explain itself before hunger forced learning? Some knowledge arrives wearing the face of mystery, demanding faith before offering proof. The Women's Council, led by the maternal grandmother Ayasha, whose own grandmother had lived through the time when strange sickness came from across the water, brought a different perspective to the debate. We argue about departures and delays, while the real question sits unasked among us like a guest we fear to acknowledge. If change approaches as our wisest voices suggest, should we not prepare for that change instead of arguing about fishing schedules? What if this mysterious disturbance brings opportunity rather than danger? What if our navigator's caution protects us not from harm, but for some greater purpose we cannot yet imagine? Her words fell into a silence that lasted several heartbeats, broken finally by the voice of Takota himself, speaking with the authority earned through decades of bringing every expedition safely home through weather, fair and foul. The grandmother speaks wisdom that cuts through confusion like a sharp blade through tangled fishing line. We prepare for the unknown by strengthening what we know. We secure our canoes against whatever storms may come, check our supplies against whatever delays we may face, ready our skills and spirits for whatever the breathing horizon may bring to our shore. And we wait with the patience that has kept our people alive through countless seasons of uncertainty. As if responding to his words, the western sky began to show the first subtle changes of sunset, but the colors appeared muted, filtered through atmospheric conditions that transformed the familiar evening ritual into something strange and portentous. The sun itself, usually a bold orange disk at this hour, seemed pale and distant, its light scattered into an odd luminescence that made everything appear slightly unreal, like a landscape viewed through water or thick glass. The very air seemed thicker, carrying sounds differently and bending light in ways that made familiar landmarks appear foreign and slightly threatening. The village settled into an uneasy sleep as the stars emerged in patterns that seemed somehow different, though none could say exactly how or why. The familiar constellations hung in their proper places, yet something in the quality of their light or the clarity of the air between earth and heaven made them appear more distant, as though the very sky had grown deeper overnight. Only Takota remained awake, sitting beside the great canoe with his eyes fixed on that mysterious horizon where sea met sky in a line that continued to waver with its strange breathing motion. The night sounds carried differently, too. The usual symphony of waves and wind, night birds and scurrying shore creatures somehow muffled and changed. It was as if the entire world held its breath along with the horizon, waiting for something momentous to break the spell of anticipation that had settled over everything like invisible fog. Even the insects seemed to whisper more quietly, their usual chorus reduced to tentative murmurs that spoke of uncertainty and watchful waiting. Sometime after the deepest hour of night, when even the most restless sleepers had finally found peace and the fire had burned down to glowing coals that painted everything in shades of red and shadow, a sound reached his ears that confirmed every instinct that had troubled him since dawn. From somewhere far out on the dark water came a new note. Not whale song or wind voice, not the clash of current against current, but something that had never before been part of the ocean's eternal conversation. It lasted only moments, fading into uncertainty before he could fully grasp its nature, but in those brief moments Dakota understood that the world was about to change in ways no navigator's experience could map. The sound carried the weight of vast distances, the resonance of deep waters disturbed by something moving beneath them, something larger than whales, more purposeful than storms, more alien than anything the sea had ever brought to their shores. The horizon had indeed been holding its breath, and now, in the deepest darkness before a new dawn, that held breath began its slow release. Whatever tomorrow would bring, the village that watched the sea and never knew who was coming had lived through its last day of innocence, guided by the wisdom of an old navigator who had trusted his instincts when trust required more courage than any storm-faced sailing ever could demand. As the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky with tentative fingers of light that seemed somehow more hesitant than usual, Dakota finally rose from his vigil, knowing that the great journey north would happen when it was meant to happen, and not before. The sea had spoken its warning through silence, the sky had sent its message through subtle wrongness, and those with wisdom to listen had heard what could not be spoken in ordinary words. The day of held breath was ending, but the consequences of that careful listening had only just begun to unfold across waters that would soon carry visitors from beyond the far line, where sky meets sea shapes no one here could name, moving in a way that would change everything for the people who had thought themselves alone in a vast and endless world.